chapter 5, Jesus has discussed the last two of the blessings in verses 10 and 11 that have to do with persecution, being reviled, being spoken evil of. And he says, rejoice and be glad, verse 12, for your reward in heaven is great. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. All right, he's talking not about there being any particular joy on earth, because being persecuted is not a source of joy, but there is an inner kind of joy or peace, knowing that when you're suffering for the sake of righteousness, God takes note of that. It would be unjust of God to forget the sacrifices that His servants have made on His behalf. And He's not going to do that. But in fact, He does know, and He does remember, and He has every intention of rewarding those who have suffered for the sake of righteousness. Now, one of the things that we'll discuss from time to time is whether there are degrees of reward in heaven and degrees of punishment in hell. Now, we'll save the punishment in hell topic until later, but this particular verse does seem to contribute a little bit to the discussion about the degrees of reward in heaven, because Jesus says, for your reward in heaven is great. All right? Well, that language seems to indicate that those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness are going to receive a reward that is greater than maybe someone who did not have to endure a period of time in which there was this kind of intense persecution. So this doesn't necessarily prove degrees of reward, but it might contribute to the discussion. Yes?
Could that be linked to the ones who are talked about in Revelations as the martyrs?
They would fall into this category, yeah. Revelation chapter 6. Yeah.
Could it also depend on the amount of treasure that we lay up for ourselves?
Yeah, and of course that's in chapter 6 when Jesus talks about laying up treasures in heaven. And another passage, and this is actually the passage that convinced me that there were degrees of reward. I actually did not believe that there were, but I was doing some work in the text of 2 John, and when I was studying verse 8, it says, watch yourself that you might not lose what we have accomplished, but that you may receive a full reward. Well, it was that word full that captured my attention. A full reward would indicate that there's partial reward. And so that language, I'm talking about 2 John verse 8, along with this passage here, and also the text in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, have all contributed to a belief that I have now that there are degrees of reward. I always believe that there are degrees of punishment, but there does seem to be some biblical evidence that there are degrees of reward. Yes.
What verse is that? 1 Corinthians 13?
Let me give you the exact verses. That would be 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Verses 12 through 15.
3:12.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians 3, 12 through 15. All right, then he says, verse 13, back here in Matthew 5, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how will it be made salty again? It's good for nothing anymore, except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. When Jesus says you are the salt, he's bringing up some interesting points about salt and what salt does. First of all, we know that salt is used as a preservative, something that's going to save whatever. If you've got meat, for example, that's packed in salt, it had a way of saving the meat, preserving the meat. Well, Christians are the salt of the earth, and as the salt, they are those that keep the world from spoiling, going into wickedness. Christians are those that forestall and prevent societies from becoming evil. Remember the discussion that God had with Abraham regarding Sodom and Gomorrah? And Abraham negotiated with God, and God said, well, if I can find 50 righteous, I'll not destroy it. And then Abraham negotiates down and down and down until finally he says, if there are 10 righteous. Well, Abraham didn't know this, but certainly he thought he was safe with the number 10. But he could have gone down to 5, and it still would have saved Sodom and Gomorrah, because you only had Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters. Those were the only ones that were saved. But had there have been 10, they would have been the salt of the city. They would have preserved the destruction of that city. We don't know how God is looking at the United States. But are there enough righteous for America to be saved, to be preserved? Well, we don't know the answer to that, but we certainly hope that that is the case. Also, we find that salt is something that spreads and permeates. Like leaven, it affects the whole to which it's added. Salt infuses that to which it's applied. Now, the idea would be that if you've got 10 righteous in Sodom, if they're doing their work, it won't be long before there are 20 righteous in Sodom. And then if they're doing their work, then it won't be long until there are 40 righteous in Sodom. A Christian business on this earth is to represent the agenda of God and to bring the gospel to all the world, to make disciples of every creature. That is our job as representatives of God. And so there should be a spreading, permeating aspect to what it is that we're doing. Third, salt adds taste and appeal. When we think about Christians, Christians are those that should make life better. Do the places that we go become better places the minute that we walk in the room? Because when we walk in the room, we bring love, we bring kindness, we bring understanding, we bring all of those attributes that are so indicative of Christianity. Or are there attributes that are brought in when we come in that are certainly not Christ-like? And because we have a sour disposition, maybe because we are constantly negative, we're griping and complaining, we're backstabbers. What happens when you walk into a room how does the atmosphere within that room change, either for good or for bad? Salt is something that adds taste and appeal. If we are the salt of the earth, then we make life better. We make life more appealing, more desirable for people. I have used this illustration before, and I know some of you haven't heard it before, but you may hear it again. But I was driving down Wadsworth a couple of years ago, following a pickup truck, and that pickup truck had a bumper sticker on it that said, "Christians are good only to be shot and killed." And my first reaction was whether that was even legal to say something like that. But second of all, I thought how sad it is that someone would feel that way and feel strongly enough about that he would actually slap that thought on the back of his truck. I thought, if he broke down, guess who it would be that would pull over to help him? If he needed some money in order to repair his truck, guess who would pony up? If his wife was broken down on some deserted road somewhere, guess who he could trust that would take care of his wife and make sure that no harm would befall her? It would be a Christian. Christians are those that make life better. Christians are those that are the kind of people that you can trust and you can count on. And that's what Jesus is saying. We make the world a better place. And then salt saves. Getting back to the first point, so nothing can save salt if the salt has lost its saving power. Now, there's a lot of S's in that. But think about the point that Jesus is making, that if the salt has lost its saltiness, it's not good for anything. And the point that he's making is anything that will not do what it was made for is not worth anything. If we are not doing what it is that God has called us to do, we're not worth anything. We are absolutely worthless to God.
Down at Corpus Christi, here last year before last, the cops pulled a station wagon over and had the gun on the lady and everything like that. And but it turned out that she had the right, it was her car and her license and everything like that. He says, well, the reason I stopped you is you got all of these bumper stickers over that saying you're a Christian, and you read that red light, and you honked at that other person there, and I thought maybe the car was stolen.
Oh.
Wow.
Ouch.
That hurts.
Yeah.
Oh.
When we think about the influence that God is counting on us bringing to the world, we have got to be those that are making a difference, making an impact. And Jesus is saying very, very boldly, very clearly, that you're of no value, God or man, if you are not one that preserves, spreads and permeates, adds taste and appeal to the world around. This is our job. This is what we're supposed to do. Francis Schaeffer, who was a guy, the upperclassman, recognized that name, the freshman may not, is a guy that died a few years ago, but he was renowned for being the foremost historian of church history. And I'll play some DVDs that he did in chapel somewhere during the time that you're here. But he notes that the church was a no-show in several periods of time in American history. During the sexual revolution, during the increase of wealth and prosperity, during periods of time where there was oppression like slavery within the United States, during the enacting of the Roe versus Wade laws that brought about legalizing abortion. Where was Christianity? Now, he's speaking generically, but his point is well taken, and that is that the Christian consensus, the Christian voice, was not that rose to meet the challenge and to flex our collective muscles as Christians. Well, in those examples, we failed. We failed as salt. Christianity is to speak up, so there will not be approval for things that are illegal or unacceptable in God's eyes.
That was Francis Schaeffer.
Francis Schaeffer. All right, then Jesus goes on to say, "You are the light of the world." He doesn't say you are a light. He says you are the light. This is God's plan for man. He doesn't have another plan. You're the light of the world. Notice the scope of God's plan. It is to be light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Obviously, it's going to be visible from all directions. He says, verse 15, "Nor do men light a lamp and put it under the peck measure, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house." Now, what sense would it make to light a light and then put something over that light that would completely block it out? You wouldn't do that. Why light the light if you're then going to defeat the purpose of having light? But what you do is you light the light with the intention of it spreading through the whole area. You light a light within a room in order to provide light for that room. All right, let's talk about what Jesus means by the word light. Light in the Bible is that which represents everything good. And it is somewhat of a broad brushstroke of application. For example, you could be light by being pure and holy. You're light when you know and tell others the truth, because the truth is light. Ignorance is darkness. Ignorance is sin, but light is sinlessness. Darkness is godlessness. Light is godliness. All right, so you are the light of the world. You are the truth for the world. And that truth needs to be set on the hill where everybody can see it. Paul is going to tell the church at Ephesus in 1 Timothy 3:15 that the church is to be a pillar and support of the truth. Well, a pillar is that which lifts up something. And the truth is that which is sitting on top of the pillars. All right, so we're lifting up the truth. The church has that responsibility. So if light is the truth, and we are the light of the world, then we are, in fact, bringing the light to everyone that's in the house and everyone that is in the world. He says, verse 16, let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. All right, so we look at this, and we are to be a light, a representative of truth, holiness, and purity. But we also recognize that you need light to see where you're going. This is a world in darkness, and they don't know where they're going. Christians are supposed to be those who do know where they're going and are able to show others the way as well. We are to be the light for a world in darkness. Now, when we get to verse 16, Jesus says, and note carefully the wording, let your light shine. There is a big difference between shining your light and letting your light shine. Think about the distinction between those two ideas. A person that is shining his light is one that is saying, look at me. Look at what I'm doing. Everybody stop and watch. Jesus is going to get into the light shiners in chapter 6 that stand on the street corners and they say long prayers, and when they go to the temple to give, they want everybody to look. All right, they're shining their light. Jesus is condemning that kind of behavior. But he is saying that you need to let your light shine in such a way that they may see your good works. Now, I was a part of a church one time in which there was a guy that was an integral part in the design and the construction and the financing of a church building. And he absolutely, he got angry if anyone would mention his name in any way, shape, or form as being involved in this project. As a matter of fact, he pulled some people aside and read them the Riot Act when they mentioned that he had been involved in that. And that was because he had a misguided understanding of this verse. He wasn't letting the light shine. Now, he wasn't seeking glory for himself, but he also wasn't letting the light shine either. When we think about what Jesus is saying, it reminds me of something that happened in the first preaching job I had in Como, Mississippi. There was a time that I became very discouraged because I believed that I was the only one that was doing anything. And so on a particular Sunday, I chose to rake the church over the coals, so to speak, and say, this isn't right, folks. You have the responsibility of getting out there and doing the works for Christ. I'm the only guy here that's doing anything.
You're the Elijah.
Well, yeah, I had the Elijah syndrome in a big way. Well, as I'm shaking the brethren out after the sermon was over, the old lady says, well, preacher, I send cards to everybody that misses services every Sunday. He said, you do? Yeah. Had another brother come by and he said, well, he said, I bring sacks of groceries to people that are shut-ins, and I have tracts inside the tracts inside the sacks that talk about the church and invite them to Bible study. You do? Another guy comes by and says, well, preacher, I've got Bible studies. I've got 2 going on right now. One on Tuesday night and one on Thursday. You do? Well, guess what this preacher did next Sunday? I ate crow. But I also brought up this point. we need to know what we're doing for Christ. We need to share what we're doing, not because we're seeking glory for ourselves. That would be wrong. But I was so discouraged because I thought I was the only one doing anything. And when I found out there are Bible studies going on, and there are sacks of groceries being given in the name of the church, and people that miss are receiving phone calls and cards in the mail, every single one of those stories encouraged me and motivated me, and I thought, man, this is awesome. This is a great church. These people are working. Well, let your light shine so that people may see your good works. Now, it's assumed that you're going to be doing it, but don't do them in secret on purpose. Let people see that you're busy in the Lord's work. Let people see that you're active. Now, the key is the last part of this verse, that they may glorify your Father who is in heaven. You don't want them to glorify you. That's not why you are letting them see you do the good works. You're doing it because you want God to be glorified, God's kingdom to receive the credit and the honor, because you're just a servant of God, and so that's why you're letting people see it. But we also need to remember the flip side to that. When we're preachers, we are to honor those to whom honor is due, but we've got to be careful not to cross that line where we're glorifying someone so much that they receive all sorts of praise and accolades from men and potentially lose their reward because they've received it here on earth. So we honor people, but there is a way that we can cross the line where we're glorifying them and they're receiving lots of praise and honor from men to the extent that there's nothing left to give them from God. So, our goal then is to cast the light upon God. Sometimes we minimize the kind of influence that we could have. Sometimes we talk ourselves out of the scope of our influence. To tell you a quick story, when I lived in Nebraska, the place that I frequently brought my business to as far as buying gasoline was a place called Pump and Pantry. I don't have them in Colorado, but they did have them in Nebraska. Still have them?
Got 'em in Virginia.
Well, when on one particular day, I'd done business there for years. I went in there with my son Lance. He was just a couple years old, and while I went up to pay for the gasoline, Lance wandered over and wasn't really paying that much attention to what he was doing. And so when I paid, I went over there, and Lance is standing in front of a new magazine rack that had just been installed, and right there in front of him was a copy of Playboy. My thought was, well, guess what? One more place that has become a kind of a haven for sin. So I grabbed Lance by the hand, and I'm walking out, and I'm saying, that's really sad, but it's just the way it is. Then I got thinking, I'm going to say something. So I went back in, and I told the gal, I said, I do business here. You've seen me come in here all the time to buy gas, and I object to that magazine rack here. And I just wanted to say that I don't appreciate it. And I told her what had happened. And she said, can you wait just a minute? This so happens that the owner is in the back. So she went and got him. He came out and introduced himself as the owner of this particular business. And he said, how can I help you? And I said, told him the story, and I said, I'm not going to do business here anymore. And that's because of that magazine rack. And he said, it'll be gone tonight. I said, what? He said, it'll be gone tonight. And it was. And so I got thinking, if I hadn't said anything, then it would have still been there. Now, they may have them now. Probably do. But at least that particular store, for the last 2.5 years that I lived there, never had a magazine rack. And what was interesting was, 2 or 3 months after that, the newspaper in York, whatever it was called, I forget now the name of it, had an article in which it talked about how lucrative magazine racks were for convenience stores. So this guy took a hit by not having that magazine rack in his store. But you can make a difference. And that's one lesson that I learned from that. Because my inclination was to say, oh well, and there be a level of resignation that this is just the way it is. The world is becoming more evil, and that's just the way it is. But we can make more of a difference than we think we can if we'll just be more vocal.
If the owners and the managers are never aware, other than the fact that someone stops coming, they need to know why you want to stop coming.
Yeah.
And then if they ignore that, then you don't go back.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of people, just like what you said, they're appreciative of the fact that you would say something, there's something wrong with this here.
All right, verse 17. Do not think that I came to abolish the law of the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Now, when we look at this particular verse in verse 18, we need to look at the two words abolish and the word fulfill. Jesus said, don't think that I came to abolish. The word abolish has the idea of removing something in kind of a violent way, ignoring the law, acting like the law is no longer in effect, of no longer of any value. And he's setting up what he is about to do. And what he is about to do is give us 6 contrasts in which he'll say, you have heard that it was said, and then a point of law is going to be quoted. But I say to you. Now, someone might very well hear Jesus do that and think he's trying to abolish the law and the prophets. But Jesus is saying, I did not come to abolish, and here's the next word, but to fulfill. So he's saying the law still has value. He's not going to throw it away. Which, by the way, this isn't the same Greek word as in Ephesians 2:15. Unfortunately, the New American Standard chose to put the word abolish in both this place and that place, Ephesians 2:15. And so it has created a direct contradiction. Here Jesus says he did not come to abolish. There it said Jesus did abolish. And when I heard that there was going to be a new edition of the NAS coming out in 2005, I wrote them and I said, please remove the contradiction between Matthew 5:17 and Ephesians 2:15. They're different Greek words. They don't mean the same thing. But they didn't remove the contradiction. So it still remains. But anyway, the point that Jesus is making is that he did come to fulfill the law. This is the word pleroo. We talked about it before in the context of prophecy. But it means to bring to its logical conclusion, to wrap something of. So the law had a particular purpose in the mind of God, and the law was going to remain in effect until the purpose of that law had been accomplished, wrapped up, fulfilled. Jesus says all that's in the law has to be accomplished. Well, that word accomplished is the same word that John uses in John 19 and verse 30 when Jesus is on the cross and he says, "It is finished." That could have been translated, "It is accomplished." Jesus isn't saying, "Oh, my life is over. I'm going to die now." He's saying, everything I was supposed to do in order to fulfill Old Testament law and prophecy has been done. It's finished. And so he breathed his last. He knew that even on the cross there were still some Old Testament prophecies that had to be fulfilled. And once he had fulfilled all of those, even the ones related to his crucifixion, then he could say, "It is finished." Now, he says, verse 18, "For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass away from the law until, would you fast? All is accomplished. Now, when you talk to Seventh-day Adventists and others that still want the old law to be a binding law, they're missing the word "until." They say, Jesus said the law wasn't going to be done away with until heaven and earth pass away. And one Seventh-day Adventist said, "And it still looks like heaven and earth is here. So the law should still be in effect." I said, well, the passage says, "Until all is accomplished." So if all had not been accomplished, the law would still be binding until there is no more earth. But once it's accomplished, then it can be removed. So Jesus is suggesting that there will come a time when the law is going to pass away. This is also a great verse to talk about verbal plenary inspiration. That's a fancy way of saying word for word inspiration. Because he says, not the smallest letter, that would be the Hebrew yod, spelled Y-O-D. It's about the same size and it almost looks exactly like our comma. Not the smallest letter, that would be the Hebrew yod, or stroke of a letter. Well, in Hebrew, you've got a number of letters that are written with like a little flag-like thing. Like they have a letter that looks like RW, and on the top of the left side of the first leg, you've got this little flag. Well, that's a stroke, the smallest stroke of a letter. So the smallest letter, the yod, or the smallest stroke of a letter. Well, it takes pen strokes to make letters, letters to make words, words to make sentences, sentences to make paragraphs. And Jesus is saying, not the smallest letter or stroke will pass away until all is accomplished. Well, that shows us that every word was that which is a part of God's divine law. And it is going to remain in force until it is fulfilled. Comment? James? All right, so he goes on to say, whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments, and so teaches others, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. All right, the King James, instead of the word annul, has the word break. The Revised Standard translates this word relax. Whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments. The rabbis, in their study and analysis of the Old Testament law, counted 613 commands. Now, once they identified the 613, then they started putting them in categories. Some more important than others. Now, that was an arbitrary, man-made treatment of God's law. God had never said, this command is more important than that command. And so the rabbis were, in fact, putting themselves in a position of making God's laws the biggies and the smallies. Jesus is saying that one will still be in the kingdom if they obey all, even if they exalt some over others. And so the King James is not accurate here. He is not saying that you can break the commands and still make it into the kingdom. But if you are obeying all, but some you've made more important than others, well, that's still okay as long as everything's being followed. So do not look at verse 18 as Jesus suggesting that you can divide God's commands into majors and minors, and the minors you can ignore. You can't. So, the Pharisees, who had taken the 613 and divided them into essentials and least essential, that was a dangerous treatment of God's law, but they did not, and Jesus is not saying that they said, now you don't have to do this one, because it's in that minor category.
So essentially he's saying it's okay if you view adultery as a worse sin than speeding, as long as you're not speeding or committing adultery.
Exactly. The great illustration.
Say that again,
That's what
please.
he's saying.
It's okay if you think of adultery as worse than speeding, as long as you're not speeding or committing adultery.
Okay.
See, the King James suggests that because speeding is not a big sin, you can go ahead and do that without consequence. Well, that's not right. But that's not what this verse is teaching. All right, the last part of verse 19 is really the key. Whoever keeps and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Those who do not put themselves in a position to say, this is bigger than that, but rather they teach and keep all God's laws equally, they're going to be great in the kingdom. Those are the kind of people that God says is going to be great in His kingdom. He doesn't want us playing fast and loose with His commands. He doesn't want us minimizing some and making others the major sins.
So, okay, wait, so if you say that, like, Jesus says later that love is the greatest command, like, he's saying it's the most important, so isn't that exalting one command above?
It's okay if God does it.
It's okay if God does it? Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
And actually, you're bringing up a good point, because in Matthew 23:23, Jesus is going to talk about the greater commands, justice and mercy and faithfulness. So there are some that God's going to say were more important than others.
Oh, and then he
But,
says, but these are the things you should have done without neglecting.
without neglecting the others. So that's a good parallel. So get that in your notes, Matthew 23:23, because it is the verse that goes along with this. So.
Just maybe a little off topic, she said that it's okay when God does it, but not when we do it. Does that mean that God is good because of what he does, or is God good, or the things that God does good because he's God?
Yes. Yeah, I think you'd have to say yes to both sides. And whatever he does is always going to be the right thing. And of course, it's his law. And as the giver of the law, then he has the right in order to make some majors and others minors. That's God's call. It's not our call to make something so minor that we don't follow it. By the way, I think what you'll find as you do word studies, and if you ever get around to doing a word study of the Bible word righteousness, especially in the context of the Old Testament, you'll find a very interesting phenomenon, and that is that a righteous person is someone that pays attention even to the little things. He is not someone that's going to play fast and loose with God's law at all. If God says it, he's going to do it. Case closed. That's it. Well, that's the kind of man that God calls a righteous man.
Yeah, the word no. What's a better word or more easier word to understand?
I like what the RSV did. It relaxes. It makes less significant, is the idea.
Excuse me, kid, that's busy type. Matthew, what you said?
23:23.
Thank you.
Verse 20. If you are a Bible marker, you need to mark verse 20. Because this is the key verse of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is a sermon about righteousness. This is what the whole sermon is about. It's centered around this particular theme of righteousness. Now, we've already talked about righteousness, but I waited until now to emphasize it. Jesus said, verse 6, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." Jesus said in verse 10, "Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness." He's going to say here in chapter 5 and verse 20 that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. And then he's going to say in 6 and verse 33, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness." All right, so what is righteousness? What does that mean? Well, Jesus is about to get into this. In order to please God, one is going to have to do better than religious leaders. Now, this would have been an absolutely astounding, shocking, and in some regard, discouraging statement on the part of Jesus. Because the scribes and the Pharisees were the religious elite. They were the top dogs, the best, the most holy men around in the eyes of the people. But Jesus comes on the scene and says, no, you're going to have to do a lot better than they are doing. And if you don't, then you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, without saying it, but still saying it, what is Jesus suggesting about the scribes and Pharisees?
They're not all that.
We're that's together.
No, I mean as far as the kingdom.
They're not going to inherit the kingdom.
They're not in.
Oh.
So the top, the best of the best are not even in God's kingdom. So this would be an eye-opener, because everybody looked up to and tried to copy and emulate the example of the scribes and Pharisees. Now, when we get to chapter 23, we're going to find out exactly what these guys were doing that was so against what God wanted. According to Romans 10, verses 3 and following, they had established a righteousness of their own. Basically, they had devised their own plan of salvation, and then they preached it like it was God's. But it wasn't God's plan of salvation, it was theirs.
Romans
10, 3, and following.
And then I heard someone use this scripture right here in reference to us giving more than 10%. This is why right here, because we have to receive what the Pharisees described it. Is that accurate to use it that way? Or?
It has nothing to do with context here. No. I mean, given 10% was required by law. And so, you know, if they were given 10%, they were doing exactly what God was requesting, but they turn right around and say, well, this verse means that we need to, you might could get that principle from 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, but I certainly wouldn't. Jesus is certainly not talking about this at all. And how do we know that's not what he means? Well, because he is about to give us 6 contrasts that are going to explain exactly what he means. You're going to have the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees on one side, and then the righteousness of God on the other. Jesus is going to contrast what the scribes and Pharisees said was righteous behavior with what truly is righteous behavior. Now, I've tried to help with the note-taking a little bit. If you look at page 46 in your syllabus, you'll have a breakdown of these 6 contrasts. Page 46. All right, let's go ahead and look at the first contrast. Well, maybe before we do that, we need to look at some general points. First of all, note the pattern that is taking place in all 6 contrasts. Jesus will begin each of the contrasts with the phrase, "You have heard." You have heard that it was said, or you have heard that the ancients were told, something along that line. Well, that terminology is the marker that Jesus is about to move on to a new contrast, a new area of discussion. Now, when he says you have heard, it's referring to what the old law said. But what Jesus is going to get into is what the Pharisees did with that old law, the interpretation and application of that old law. So you have heard that it was said not to kill, but I say. All right, so that's the next pattern. But I say to you. All right, the scribes and Pharisees have told you this. Now I'm telling you that. So he is contrasting what it was that the Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes had taught the people.
Hey, Denny,
Yes.
I want to ask you a question right there. You see in verse 21 there in your Greek text where it says, you heard that it was said, tois archaios.
Yeah.
Okay. The tois archaios, some of the translations say, you have heard that it was said to them of old time. But I think that should be translated, you heard that it was said by the ancients. By the ancients, meaning by the rabbis, by the elders, by the Pharisees. And if you read it that way, he's talking about what the Pharisees said. And especially when you, and not just what the law said, because especially if you go down to the very end of 43, where he says, you heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Well, the Old Testament never says that. That's what the rabbis said. So what do you think about that?
No, that's exactly right. The jumping off place is what the law said, and then what the scribes and Pharisees did as far as interpretation of that law is what he's getting at. So it's kind of a package. You know, the beginning spot was what the law said, but then what they did as far as the interpretation of that law is what Jesus is going to address.
Right, but what I'm getting at is that Jesus is not contrasting what the Old Testament said with what he says. Because back in verse 15, he said, if you're really under the rule of God, you're going to do everything the Old Testament said.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'm not trying to suggest something different. Now, he's not contrasting himself with the old law, but contrasting his teaching with what the Pharisees did with Old Testament passage. So thanks for bringing that up. That makes it clearer. All right, when we look at this, notice how the authority of Jesus is being shown. I say to you, this is what they've said, this is what I'm saying. And it was this kind of powerful teaching that led them to say what they did in 28 and 29, where they marveled at what they had heard, because he taught as one having authority, not as the scribes and Pharisees. Well, Dan made reference to the rabbinic teachings that took place in various times in history. Well, when you read, for example, in the Mishnah about these rabbinic teachings, everybody's quoting everybody else. Rabbi Ben Yaakeh say, and Rabbi Ben Yehuda say, and Rabbi Ben... Well, the best of the rabbis were those that could sit there and rattle off what all of the other rabbis have said about a particular topic. Jesus doesn't come in quoting anybody. He comes in saying, let me tell you, what's what here? This is what I say. Well, that was something that was quite novel. The people were not used to that kind of authoritative teaching. And, of course, Jesus is the Son of God. When we get to chapter 17 and you've got what happens on the Mount of Transfiguration, when Moses and Elijah are gone, the voice of God says, this is my beloved Son, hear him. This is who I want you to listen to. He is the authority of God. Hebrews chapter 1, I don't have this passage on the PowerPoint, but you ought to get that in your notes. It said God spoke to the fathers and prophets in many portions in many ways, but in these last days he has spoken to us in his Son. So Jesus is the Logos of God. He is the spokesman of God. John 1, chapter 1, verse 1. All right. All right, moving on. The first of the 6 contrasts has to do with anger. going to cover verses 21 through 26. You have heard that the ancients were told. Generally, people did not read these things for themselves. This was something that the religious leaders would tell them, teach them. You shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. All right, so with this first contrast, the Pharisees were saying, in effect, you could get angry, but you can't kill. God said, don't kill. But running further than what the law said, they taught that anger was something that was an emotion itself that was not inappropriate for God's people. But if you murdered, you're going to pay. We're going to drag you to the court, and the court's going to find you guilty. And once the court finds you guilty, then you're going to be stoned according to law. You're dead. You're not going to escape the penalty of law.
Did they draw a distinction between killing and murder?
No. Well, I said no. That's really not true, because God's law prescribed putting to death those that, for example, had committed adultery and so on. Even if you go as far back as the Noahic covenant in Genesis chapter 9, verses 6 and following, God instituted as part of that Noahic covenant that if a man sheds man's blood, then by man his blood shall be shed. But then you've got the Ten Commandments that say, thou shalt not kill. And so...
Does it say thou shalt not murder?
Well, as far as looking for a distinction within Hebrew, I don't think you're going to find one. Dan, do you know anything different about that?
No, not the word, just the context.
Yeah, context. All right, so Jesus then says, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Whoever shall say to his brother, Raka, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever shall say, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the hell of fire. Now, scholars have pointed out, and I believe it's at least worth considering, that Jesus is given us the sin of anger that falls into three categories. And the reason why this is a legitimate way of looking at that is because the consequences of each sin is greater as Jesus moves through these three categories. So the first, he says, you're angry with his brother. Some consider this like a silent anger. You're burning mad, but you're controlling your tongue. Well, you're still going to be liable to the court, and you're not going to be brought before a civil court. You wouldn't even be brought before the court of the Sadducees, but there are consequences in the divine court that Jesus is referring to. And then second, he says, and whoever shall say to his brother, Raka. Raka is an Aramaic word. And that Aramaic word has something along the lines of being worthless, no good for nothing. Some say that it has the idea of being an empty head. You know, we laugh about somebody being barehead. Blondes are frequently noted for that. Well, things that we might do in jest, these people are not doing in jest. This is an outflow of anger. They're mad. And their anger is that which is now boiling out to where they're actually saying terms that might not seem all that bad to us, but in the ancient world were very insulting to the person. And Jesus says, if you're not able to control your emotion to the extent that you can't control your tongue, there are going to be consequences for that. And then finally, he says, if you say, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the hell of fire. The word fool may not sound like it's all that bad a term, and we'll use the word fool in some of our language as well. But Jesus is using this word as a strong expression of contempt. And it's like damning someone, condemning someone to an eternity in hell, and saying that they are completely brain dead, they have no intelligence whatsoever, and they're worthless for God and man. Well, you're striking out with words of condemnation. You're hypercritical of someone. And Jesus is saying that is an offense worthy enough to receive the sentence of hellfire. Now, he uses the word in Greek here, Gehenna. Gehenna is the idea or the concept of a place of punishment thrown into the fires of hell. And we'll talk more about the meaning of this word in other classes. What's that?
Okay, I was just going to ask the correlation between that and Gehenna.
Okay, yeah, we'll come back around to that. All right, what is Jesus saying? Jesus is saying that true righteousness is that which is found from within. The Pharisees and scribes were concerned with external obedience and not so much internal thoughts and concepts. Jesus is saying, no, it's greater than that, more than that. You have to control the way that you think and the way that you feel. Because if you're able to control anger, then you're not going to have a problem with murder. But if you are unable to control your emotions and you do let that anger boil over, then you're going to find yourself in a situation where you'll overtly violate the law of Moses, and that is you will murder someone else. All right? Then in verses 23 and 24, Jesus is still continuing this theme of anger. If therefore you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. First of all, you need to know that you're not the one with the problem. You're not the one that's mad. He's the one that's mad. He has something against you. But Jesus is teaching that you need to be proactive in dealing with the brother that has the problem. And you go and you try to make reconciliation with him. Now, in a perfect world, he should be the guy that is dealing with the issues that he's got. But he's not. And so you go ahead and try to make peace and help the anger that resides in his heart and the hatred be resolved. Notice that Jesus is teaching a principle also that has to do with worship. You've come to worship God. You've come to present an offering at the altar. But Jesus is saying there's something more important than doing that right here and now. Leave your offering there before the altar. Go take care of the conflict that you have with your brother. And then once that's done, and you've made reconciliation, then come back and present your offering. Comments on that? Yes.
I've heard of people saying that they wouldn't take communion because they heard or they know that their brother had something against them or they were at odds with someone else, so they wouldn't take communion. Is Jesus going to that extent in this passage? I mean, I know this is before the church and all that, but...
Well, yeah, I would say that in principle, that's right. That they do need to think about making reconciliation, because if you don't, it's going to negatively impact your worship. Just like in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 8, Paul says, I want holy men to pray without wrath and dissension. If you got men that are leading in worship or people engaging in worship that are also dealing with these kind of conflicts with their brothers, it's going to negatively impact their worship. And so you need to take care of those things first, and then you'll be able to worship with a clear mind.
Let's just put it another hypothetical and say that it's not something that would maybe cause my mind to wander during worship. Does it still need to be done before worship?
Not necessarily. I think maybe we're...
in the sense of them having a problem with me, but and I maybe heard that, but I don't have a problem with the situation, and so it isn't necessarily going to affect my worship or something like that.
Yeah, but plus I think how often is it that, I mean, it's 2 minutes before communion that we find out about a problem. If we know about something like that, why not deal with it on a Saturday or a Friday? And by the time you get around to Sunday, you've taken care. The principle of what Jesus is saying is that which you recognize should be done before you engage in worship. And so, but I still don't want to minimize the scope of what he's saying, and that is, if there are conflicts among brethren, that you need to try to take care of those, because it will be something that will impact worship. Dan, what would you say about this?
Well, I just contextually say that his point is the reverse of the Pharisees' point, whereas they say that you can't get away with murder, but you can get away with everything else. Jesus says not only is that not right, but I'm telling you to go in the whole opposite direction and do everything you can to reconcile with your brother and minimize conflict of any kind. So the whole paragraph taken as a whole is just the extreme opposite of what the Pharisees were trying to say. The whole different attitude and direction, and that's what he's getting at.
Right. All right, so look at verse 25. You got more of the same. He says, make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, in order that your opponent may not deliver you to the judge, and the judge the officer, and you be thrown in prison. Truly I say to you, you shall not come out there until you have paid up the last cent. All right, anger is that which frequently reveals itself through the loose tongue. And now you've got somebody who is bringing you to court, and you run into him on your way to the courthouse. Well, you've got a window of opportunity to really give him a piece of your mind. And as we're talking about context, uncontrolled anger is going to lead you to do that. The Pharisees would have no problem with it. Tell him what you think. Give him the what for. Read him the riot act. He's taking you to court. This dirty, no good so-and-so is doing all that. Well, Jesus said, look, if you've got control of yourselves, if you're really going to be a righteous person in the eyes of God, then that's going to lead you to controlling that emotions and also thinking about making friends. Looking at the situation and trying to find a resolution that will be good for all parties involved. And so while you're on the way, and of course in ancient times people walked, and so it's possible that you run into your adversary on the way to the court, and you're going to be walking with them for the next several hours, or maybe the next several days. Well, guess what? A great window of opportunity has been given to you not to rip and tear on this guy, but to make friends quickly with him, and then the opponent will not deliver you to the judge. Now that language tells us that you're guilty. Whatever it is that you've done, he's got the leg up on you, because if it goes to court and the evidence is presented, you're going into the slammer. And so make friends quickly with him, and when you finally get before the judge, he's saying, you know, he's not such a bad guy after all, and I've kind of grown to like him, and so I don't even think we're going to go before the judge. We're just going to just let this whole thing pass. That's wisdom that's being exemplified. But Jesus says, if you're not going to be a righteous man, and you are going to be someone that isn't going to be able to control your tongue, then you get exactly what you deserve. If, verse 26, you get thrown into prison, truly I say to you, you shall not come out of there until you have paid the last cent. That's Jesus' way of saying you're going to get exactly what you deserve. You get thrown into prison, well, don't be surprised. That's what you deserve to get, because you couldn't control your tongue. Yeah.
Is there a parallel between us being in the right relationship with Jesus and not being denied before the judge, which is the Father? Or no?
Rephrase the question. I guess I'm not getting what you're asking. Okay, say it again, man.
Okay. Is there a parallel to be drawn here between the opponent being Jesus and...
Oh, I see. Is the opponent like Jesus? Well, I think you could say yeah, because if we do not make things right with Christ, then we're going to reap what we've sown, and the penalty will be charged us because we're not forgiven. But yeah.
Yeah, you said if you were guilty, you basically should know better. But do you think it's also like instructing us if, say, maybe we're innocent, still, go the whole 9 yards and be willing to be losing or take a losing end of the deal?
Well, if you're innocent, there's still not grounds for you ripping and tearing on the guy who's bringing you before the court, because the principle that Jesus has given, whether you're guilty or not guilty, is still the same, and that is, unlike the standard of righteousness established by the scribes and Pharisees, there's a new level here that's being given, and that is, you are able to control your emotions. And you are not going to let your tongue run wild and say things in anger and hatred. That's the opposite of what they were being taught.
But with the part when it says make friends quickly with your opponent, it's not saying like negotiate or come to. I don't think it's going that far to say that much as far as negotiation.
Yeah, I would think so.
So it's best to settle outside court.
Yeah, I mean, you're trying to settle outside of court, trying to get this resolved before you even get there, and hopefully the guy will drop it all together. But he's not going to drop it if you're going to rip on him. I mean, all you're doing is you're motivating him. He can't get you before the judge fast enough if you're going to be ripping on him. And Jesus says, and why would you be surprised about any leniency? As a matter of fact, once he gets it before the judge is going to say, all right, and you're going to stay there till the entire fine is paid. Well, unlike today in the first century, when you went to jail, you weren't being paid anything. So how are you going to pay back something when you have no earning ability? Well, you've got to rely upon friends and relatives, if you've got any, And if you don't have any, then you could be there for a very long time. All right, let's take 15 and be back at 2:30. And on that, do you have anything different to say, or?
No.
Maybe? What about James, where he said, about how we have a look, we desire, and then we build? Is this showing us that it's a whole lot easier for us to get rid of that anger when it first comes up? It's just like anytime we get into something, it's a whole lot easier to back away from that first step than it is after we're all the way in.
Yeah, exactly. And again, when we're contrasting what the Pharisees were saying, they weren't trying to put any kind of limitations upon the emotion of anger. You can just let it run its course, but the problem is, they said, but don't kill anybody.
Do the first two there fall into the context of what Paul's saying in 1 John 5:17 about the sin not leading to death? Or not John, not Paul, but John?
No, that would be something completely different there. Okay, second contrast has to do with adultery. No, that's not right. That should say lust.
Oh, interesting.
Says you shall not commit adultery. You're on the target there.
Oh yeah, that's right. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. All right? As with the first one, Jesus is quoting a portion of Old Testament law. This is Exodus 20 and verse 14. It's what the commandment said. But I say to you that everyone who looks on a woman to lust for her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. The Pharisees were saying and teaching, in effect, you can look, you can lust, but you cannot touch adultery. So look all you want, do whatever you want in your mind and in your heart, but you can't commit the act of adultery. Jesus, though, is bringing us to a whole new level of righteousness. But I say, notice again the authoritative way that Jesus is approaching this, that everyone who looks on a woman to lust for her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. So he's calling one to a higher level of spirituality. Now, he says that you're looking to lust. This is why he's looking. Then that's when it becomes sin. Now, I believe that there's an important distinction that needs to be made, and this verse has been one that I believe has been applied in ways that were not intended. When a red-blooded American male looks and sees a woman that is immodestly dressed, he is automatically going to have some sexual feelings. It's just impulsive. Jesus is not saying that that is the sin. That's not the sin that he's talking about. You're looking to lust. So let's say that you're in the mall and you see a woman wearing something that's very immodest. Well, you look, you see her, you have that initial reaction, but then you look away and you reorganize your thoughts and fill it with something else. Everything's fine. No sin has been committed. But if you look and then you continue to look, now you've moved it into the category with Jesus is talking about. You are beginning to look in a sexual way. You are lusting. There is a desire there that that you've created in your mind, well, when that happens, Jesus says you've committed adultery in your heart. When I was teaching a class at York College years ago, probably had 50 to 60 sophomore students in the class, and I said, how many of you think that you're going to commit adultery somewhere down the line? And you can get away with a college class asking a question like that. So raise your hand if you think you're going to commit adultery. Well, nobody in the class raised their hand. I said, all right, how many of you have at least once in your life been guilty of lusting? Raise your hand. Well, everybody raised their hand. I said, here is Jesus' point. You don't plan to commit adultery, but if you don't deal with lust, then you are bringing yourself down a path that will eventually lead to adultery. The Pharisees said you could look but you couldn't touch. Jesus is saying, no, you can't look. Because if you do look, then you're putting yourself in a position that will eventually lead to committing the actual act down the road anyway. But rather, a truly righteous person is one that is concerned about the inside, making sure that their mind and heart is that which is spiritually attuned to God. Because it is a sin in the eyes of God to lust. The Pharisees didn't think so. Jesus is saying, but I'm here to tell you that it is a sin for you to lust. And that as far as God is concerned, you've committed adultery. Now, you haven't literally physically done it, but you've committed adultery with her already in your heart. All right, so that leads us to the next question. Is this grounds for divorce? A woman walks in on her husband and he's looking at a Playboy. Or he's on an X-rated internet website. So, biblically, she can divorce him and remarry. Right? No. Why not? Well, here are my reasons as to why not. And then, Dan, we'll throw that over to you and see if you've got a different take on it. First of all, Jesus is qualifying the kind of adultery by saying that it's adultery in the heart. Second, you have not become one flesh with anyone. As we talk about, it takes two to tango. Well, the sin of adultery that is a divorceable offense is that in which there actually was another person involved and you became one flesh, and that in that passage, 1 Corinthians 6:16, with the harlot. And related to that is this something that's in the category of the sins of the flesh that's defined in Galatians 5:19, and the concept of lust is not what's being listed there. That doesn't necessarily prove one thing or another. It's just trying to quantify what Jesus means when he says that it is a heart offense. And then a fourth point is one that has to do with logic. Now, make an illustration and then we'll come back to this. In 1 John 3 and verse 15, John says there that everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. All right, so if we find someone guilty of hate, should we lock them up? Should we consider them guilty of murder? Are there going to be, or should there be, the same exact consequences for the person that hates as that which the person that kills? Now, make sure that you understand the distinction that I'm trying to make. Jesus says it's adultery. And so, when we stand before God on the day of judgment, the person that killed and the person that hated are going to find the same angry God in judgment. But are there consequences? Are the consequences the same in this life? And I'm saying, no, they're not. And they're not the same for hatred. We don't throw someone in jail because they hated, like we throw someone in jail who is guilty of murder. And then another point of logic, and that is kind of related to my York College illustration, where we asked, all right, how many have been guilty of lusting? Well, everybody raised their hand. We could never sustain any marriage because all of us, if we're honest, have admitted that we've been guilty of this sin at one time or another, male and female alike. And so how could any marriage be sustained logically when we look at a sin like this that is, in fact, something that is prevalent among us? Yes.
I know Jesus is trying to raise us to a higher level of spirituality than the Pharisees, but do you think he's also doing us a favor by addressing the root cause of the more significant problem?
Yeah.
Anger leading to murder and lust leading to.
Yeah. If you don't want to be ever guilty of committing murder, then deal with your anger. If you don't ever want to be guilty of adultery, then make sure you don't lust. Because you don't lust, you're not going to be committing adultery. So you're exactly right. That's his point. And that is a higher level of righteousness. And that's true righteousness as opposed to the very shallow level of righteousness that was given by the scribes and Pharisees. Dan, what say ye on this?
Well, in 521, when he says anger, 522, the word anger is a present participle, and he means keeps on being angry, feeds your anger. And the word looking is a present participle in 27, and this means to keep on looking. And you can't keep from lusting. Everybody's going to lust, as you put it out. Lust just means desire. And every red-blooded American has done this thousands of times when those thoughts come into your mind. But what he's talking about is pursuing the idea of sexual congress with some woman who's not your wife. You keep on looking. You keep on pursuing. And that's spiritual adultery. I agree with you on what you said about the divorce thing, that this is a cause for divorce. I have had some places where it caused me a pretty bad dilemma. Let me share with you what that is. You get out here in the real world, and you get the people who have real problems with internet sex and so forth. You go one step further when you stop just being involved in pornography and you start getting involved with live internet cyber sex, where there's a live person on one end and there's a live person on the other end, and they're engaging willfully with one another in sexual stuff over the internet. Well, if somebody claimed to me that was adultery, I don't know that I could convincingly for sure say that it wasn't, but I see where you're coming from. I can see both sides of it, because there comes a point when people are willfully, both of them, engaging in sex with each other. So it's presenting some weird ethical dilemmas for us, the more of this cyber stuff.
Yeah, that it is.
That becomes sexual immorality there. That's the same. Is that pretty much the same word?
Well, when we think about the idea of porneia, that what's considered sexual immorality, a lot of lexicons will actually bring in the idea of intercourse.
Okay.
Right. And so that's, I think, getting back to what Dan is saying, that's part of the dilemma of where have they crossed the line, that it's not just lusting, but they've taken it to a whole new level where through cyberspace, they were having sex with each other, and everything short of the actual engaging in the act is taking place. That does.
Yeah, and I agree that what Jesus really intended with the exception for divorce was having intercourse with somebody else. Because like you said, if that wasn't the case, then everybody would have a scriptural right for divorce, because what man hasn't lusted after another woman, you know? So that would be a logical fallacy.
Other comments on that?
I would just
Yeah,
like to
John.
say that, no, I agree with not the grounds for divorce, but that you have violated and compromised trust, regardless if it's through adultery or through lust. It's between husband and wife. You compromise that area of trust, and it's a hard road back.
Yeah, it is a hard road back. And a righteous man would never go there. You know, he recognizes that, this is something that maybe it hasn't led to the actual literal act of adultery, but, in his wife's mind, he's gone where he doesn't need to go, and that's negatively impacted their relationship. All right, he says after that, and if your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out, throw it from you, for it is better for you that one of the parts of your body perish than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand makes you stumble, cut it off and throw it from you, for it is better for you that one of the parts of your body perish than for your whole body to go into hell. All right, Jesus, first of all, is using terminology that they would be very familiar with, because they considered the right hand and the right eye to be your most important, precious body parts. So, if you're going to lose anything, you don't want to lose your right hand and you don't want to lose your right eye. That was just their way of perceiving the value of a person's body. Now, you might say that indicates that most of them were right-handed probably, and would be right. But they had some freaks of nature, and but most of them were normal.
Had a few perfect people.
Yeah.
That's dirty.
We're pretty rare.
So the point that he's making is, it's better to lose the dearest thing in life than to lose one's soul. How valuable is the right eye when compared to eternity? How valuable is the right hand when looking at the scope of forever? Well, you would be better off to lose one or both than for your soul, your body, to be thrown into hell. He uses the word Gehenna again, just like he had used it earlier in verse 22. So he's emphasizing the earnestness one should have in pursuing righteousness. You need to be serious about this. So serious that you're not going to allow any obstacle to stand in your way of pursuing the highest level of righteousness. Not like what is being established by the scribes and Pharisees, but one that knows no limits as far as your commitment and dedication to be righteous in the eyes of God. The question, though, that we have is this to be applied literally? Now, in your syllabus, I gave you an article that was in the newspaper. Man chops off right hand because Bible told him to. On page 47 of your syllabus. And in that particular article, there was a guy, he had his Bible open to this very passage and determined that this was in fact what Jesus was teaching needed to be done. So he cut off his right hand, and he was in the process of plucking out the right eye when his roommate came and saw the bloody carnage and apparently the eye was not yet completely removed, and asked his roommate if he would help him complete the job of cutting off the right eye. Well, that's just one. I actually have a file of about 5 or 6 other newspaper stories in which people have tried to literally exact this particular teaching of Jesus. All right? The answer is no. But why is it no?
So when he had his father, he had cut off his left hand and put out his left eye for doing what he did to his right hand and right eye.
You got the sin and okay. First of all, they turned the church into a hospital. All of a sudden, we're not a bunch of people of God. We're a bunch of people walking around with amputations all over the place. Practically speaking, logically speaking, that's pretty foolish. Second, it wouldn't keep one from sinning in the heart or with the body. So if I have a problem with stealing, so I cut off my right hand, well, guess what? I still got my left one, and I can steal with that. So I cut off my left one, well, guess what? I can still grab something and steal it with my mouth. So what am I supposed to do? Cut the head off? Or you got guys that can do just about anything with their feet. You've seen that. They can write with their feet. They can, so here's a guy that's cut off both hands, but he's able to reach up there and steal something with his leg.
That'd be pretty cool.
So, or here's a guy that's got a problem with lust, so he plucks out the right eye. Well, now he's lusting with the left one. So he plucks out the left one. Well, guess what he's still got in his memory banks?
Yeah.
All of those images that he had seen with his eyes are now in his mind, and he continues to lust.
So
when you think about what Jesus is saying, it's not going to solve the problem of sinning just because you cut off body parts. And a third reason why it's not to be applied literally is self-abasement is against God's will, Colossians 2:23. God doesn't want us doing things to the body for religious purposes. That's not the kind of dedication or service that He is asking for.
Does that mean religious type tattoos? Like someone getting a cross tattoo? Is that what Paul's talking about in Colossians? Or taking it too far?
Yeah, it's too far. Abasement would be like the whipping of yourself, and hitting yourself with chains, and cutting yourself with knives, like some of the first century, second century religious fanatics were doing.
I don't like it.
Like in the Da Vinci Code.
Another great movie.
I didn't see the movie, I read the book.
Still a great.
Oh.
I read the book too. And there was a word for that belt that he wore, but I forget what it was.
The chalice, wasn't it a chalice?
chalice.
Also on CSI.
Shut up.
Okay, so getting back around, what then is being said? What's being said is that third point. Jesus is emphasizing the earnestness one should have in pursuing righteousness. You should have the commitment, the perspective that you're not going to let anything stand in your way of being what God wants you to be. And that has to do with the heart. It doesn't have to do with whether you literally have a right hand or a right eye. It has to do with how you're controlling yourself within. Now, isn't everything that we've said up till now a heart deal anyway? Anger versus murder, lust versus adultery. So in order to stay consistent contextually, we would still understand that Jesus is saying you've got to control the ticker here. You got to make sure that your heart, your devotion, your level of commitment is what God wants it to be.
Is this what we would call hyperbole, when you're just using extreme exaggeration to make a point? As far as cutting off your
It would be.
members?
Yeah. All right, let's move on to contrast number 3, divorce. it was said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of dismissal. All right, this is based upon Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4.
Chapter 24?
It was, yeah, 24, 1 through 4. Now, divorce was allowed in Jewish circles, and it involved the woman giving the woman a legal certificate of divorce.
I got a question. It's kind of not really a serious question, but how did it go from in the Bible times when the women were trying to be suitable for the husband to today when the guy has to be suitable for the woman?
What?
I don't know.
Wait, I don't understand the question.
We talk about how back in the Old Testament it was a man's world. I think it's kind of what you're getting at. And today it's not so much that way. But
Real quick, a
Well,
woman was
if the
not allowed
man's
to
got the
give,
right woman, he's still in his word, it's his world.
a woman was not allowed to give a certificate of divorce to the man, is that correct?
in Old Testament times. The certificate that we're talking about was called a get. Those of you from the South would say get, but it's actually pronounced get.
Oh, so that's a different.
It's English.
Oh,
It's not
The language
What's that,
spoken
Blondie?
in America. Correctly.
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about.
The certificate, the get, said, "Lo, thou art free to marry any man." And you can read that in the Mishnah. One of the tractates is called Gittin, chapter 9, verse 3. You've learned about the Mishnah in language and research. Have you got to that point yet? No, haven't gone to the library. Michael introduced the Mishnah.
Unless you did have the proper Southern pronunciation right there. Gittin.
That's Hebrew.
What's you from Nazareth?
One time, I'll tell you a funny story. One time I was teaching a class that had 5 women in it that were, shall we say, well past marrying age. And so anyway, this was part of the topic, and I said the get said, "Lo, thou art free to marry any man." They said, "I got to give you one of those."
All right.
It wasn't like a, as long as you got that, you could pick out your guy.
Sadie Hawkins Day.
An old Sadie Hawkins. All right, this was so that the woman would not be charged with adultery if she remarried, because people would know that she had been married, and now she's marrying someone else, and they could have charged her with adultery, but the get proved that she had been released from the marriage commitment, and so she was not an adulteress if she married again. All right, so what are the Pharisees doing? The Pharisees are saying, divorce, divorce, divorce. Much as you want, just make sure you give the little woman the certificate on her way out the door.
Weren't there 2 views at the time of Christ? You had Shammai and Hillel. One of them believed that you could divorce your wife if she burnt the toast.
Yeah. We'll actually talk about that in chapter 19. Right.
Wow.
Kind of like today, really.
What, she can divorce you if you burn the toast?
No, the Pharisees saying divorce all you want.
Yeah. So the Pharisees had the concept, just give her the certificate if you divorce. Jesus is saying, no, don't do this. think about what it does to her. What it does to her. Now, this is a perspective that's different than Matthew 19 and verse 9. Well, what does it do to her? Well, it forces her into survival mode, where she will most likely try to remarry. Sometimes we have difficulty putting ourselves in a first century frame of reference. Women were not independent like women today are independent. A woman today could get a divorce, and the thought of her marrying again is not necessarily something that we would think of. She might be, 21st century woman, and she goes out and she gets a job and she supports herself, and she bought her own house, she's bought her own car, she pays her own bills, and she's quite independent. Well, in today's world, we see women doing that all the time, but not in the first century world. In the first century world, it just wasn't set up where women were going to be able to live independently of a husband. And the frame of mind in that first century was that a woman without a husband was not a complete woman. There was something wrong with a woman that would be unmarried, and so there was a stigma that went along with being unmarried. Well, that's not true today, but it was true in Jesus' day. So here is a guy, Jesus saying, here is a man, he just decides he wants to do what the Pharisees said they could do, and he just wants to divorce her. And so he does. Well, by doing that, he is putting her in a very difficult situation that is probably, most likely, going to lead to her finding another man and marrying him. And if she did marry him, then she would be guilty of adultery. Not only that, but the one who marries her would also be guilty of adultery. And the reason is because she is not eligible for remarriage.
Now, can you repent from that adultery and still be married to that person?
What? No,
With the
because
original husband and wife?
But I mean, like, you have a couple, they get divorced because the woman cheated, the woman goes and gets married to someone else. Can she repent and still be married to that same person? So that has to lead to another divorce, which is something that God hates.
Well, that's terminology that God never joined her to that second man in the first place. All right, so here's a guy, let's say that he's never been married before. And so he encounters this woman who has been put away, and he decides to marry her and do that. By his doing that, he's committing adultery as well. All right, why is he committing adultery? Because he is joining himself to a woman that is not free to marry. Now, there are those that have said that when a divorce occurs, the marriage bond is broke. And when the marriage bond is broke, all parties involved, the husband and wife both, are then free to contract themselves in another marriage relationship, and God's okay with that. Well, if God was okay with that, then how do you make sense of this verse? How do you say that he's divorced her and she goes and marries another man? That's adultery. And the guy that marries her, that's adultery. How can it be adultery? Well, there's only one logical biblical answer, and that is because she is not free in the eyes of God. Yeah, there was a divorce that occurred. The text makes it clear that he divorced her. But she's not eligible for remarriage. Now, there's more to this verse. Jesus adds an exception clause. He says except for the case of immorality. All right, the Greek word there is the Greek word porneia. We get pornography from that Greek word. Sexual immorality is what the word means. All right, so look again at the verse. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the cause of unchastity or immorality, makes her commit adultery. All right, so the exception clause. So it would be then acceptable for a righteous man to put away his wife for immorality. He's not violating God's standard of righteousness by putting away a fornicating wife. Can you give me an illustration we've already talked about? Yeah, Joseph being a, what kind of man? A righteous man, desired to put her away secretly. All right? A righteous man could do that. And that was well within the scope of God's law.
Okay, you're emphasizing a righteous man. What about and I'm not even getting to maybe a different thing here, but what about a non-believer whose wife cheats on him, and then he divorces her, and then becomes a Christian, or maybe even not? Scripturally, would he be able to remarry?
No, but we'll have to wait until Matthew 14 to explain why. So we'll get to that.
Okay.
All right, so this second part is what parallels Matthew 19, the exception clause. Parallels Matthew 19 and verse 9, where Jesus gives an exception clause there. But I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for immorality and marries another commits adultery. Jesus says there. So the exception clause is found in both places. But in this case, just going back to chapter 5:32, he would not be making her commit adultery because she already has committed adultery. So you can't say, well, she committed fornication, and if he sends her away, even though she committed fornication, he's going to make her commit adultery. Which, believe it or not, I got an email last week in which a guy was trying to champion that very cause. He said, she already did commit adultery. How is he making her commit adultery? She committed adultery when she still had a husband. So he's not forcing her or causing her to do anything. So the exception clause is that which reverses what followed after the exception clause. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife makes her commit adultery. All right? The exception clause would reverse that, but whoever divorces his wife except for the cause of unchastity would not make her commit adultery. She already has committed adultery. So whatever the woman does after the man puts her away for sexual unfaithfulness is not his problem. It's not his concern. The fact of the matter is, she was unfaithful to him while married, and he, as a righteous man, has a God-given right to put her away. Now, she can't remarry, though, for the same reasons that are given here and in Matthew 19:9. Now, we talk about, and we use this terminology, the innocent party and what the innocent party can do, and what the guilty party can or cannot do. And in neither case, Matthew 5:32 or Matthew 19:9, does the guilty party have a right to remarry. They don't. Because they're the ones that committed the offense, and their mates made the decision that they were not going to stay married anymore, and so that the guilty party was put away. Well, in Matthew 19 and verse 12, Jesus uses an illustration about eunuchs. And he's really not talking about eunuchs. He's talking about marriage. And he talks about those who have made themselves a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom. He's talking about somebody that was guilty, the guilty party, in a marriage relationship and has been put away because of that. Well, they make themselves a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom. Because if the guilty party would remarry, then they're living in adultery. But if the guilty party wants to go to heaven, then they make themselves a eunuch. Well, who's a eunuch? Somebody that isn't going to have sex. Well, they make themselves somebody who's not going to have sex. Why? For the sake of the kingdom. They want to have a right relationship with God from this point on. And the way to do that is to live a sex-free life from that point on.
Do you mind if I ask a question getting more into that, or do you want me to wait till later?
Yeah, we need to wait till 19.
Well,
I'm going to use an entire class period just talking about 19, and we'll get into all the questions and scenarios and all that stuff. But if you got a question on 532, you can ask it now. But I just want to make sure you understand what we're
saying. It's just that shows the importance of being sure of your mate before you're married.
Well, yeah. Because you get into some stuff that you don't want to get into.
So is the innocent party allowed to remarry, or is that getting into chapter 19?
Well, I think it applies to both.
Okay.
But he would be allowed to remarry. Because Jesus says in Matthew 19:9, who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. But the exception clause reverses everything on the backside of the exception. So whoever divorces his wife for immorality and marries another does not commit adultery. So the grammar of 19:9, when properly understood, would answer the question, and that is the innocent party can remarry. Okay, so more to say on 5:31 and 32. Back, kind of rewinding or reeling this in and getting it back to the context. The man who foolishly and unscripturally divorces his wife, who has not committed fornication, gets the ball rolling on two other sins. All right, so now we're taking the exception clause out. He just wants to divorce her. Jesus says, if you do that, first of all, you put her in a situation where she most likely is going to get remarried. And that would be adultery. And you are part responsible for that. You're going to have to assume ownership for that. And second, adultery by the man who marries her. You've got to assume ownership for that too. Because you brought him into a situation where he's marrying a woman that he doesn't need to be marrying. And if she had stayed your wife like she should have, because she didn't do anything worthy of divorce, she didn't commit sexual immorality, so you shouldn't have been putting her away in the first place. But now that you have, you're bringing another man into the equation, and now he's going to sin if he marries her.
So is he saying that it's not, does the wife and the man who marries her still sin? Are they still guilty of adultery?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what's the woman supposed to do? She's just supposed to try to be independent in that time period?
Yeah. Well, what he's trying to do is trying to get them, don't do this. Just, a righteous man is not going to put away a faithful wife. Never even going to think about it. Never going to even consider it. That's his point. And see the contrast with what the Pharisees were doing? I mean, write out her little piece of paper and slap it in her hand. Jesus says, no. You've got to have a really good, legitimate reason to send her away. And there's only one legitimate reason to do that, and that's that she was sexually unfaithful to you. Other than that, she didn't stay your wife.
The wife, she was taken from her parents' house to his house. She's never been out on her own. She's been really put in a bad position.
Well, she hasn't been taught a vocation. She's been taught to be a wife. With all the domestic chores. That's what she knows, and that's what she's skilled at.
Okay. Takes me back to Joseph and Mary again, because, okay, now they were betrothed, but he was going to send her away secretly, and which would require, what it would be? Yeah.
Right.
Okay. But would that have, okay, secretly, number one, he was going to take care of her, to make sure she was cared for the rest of her life, so to speak?
Potentially.
He was a righteous man.
Yeah. I potentially with that, but I think more likely he was going to allow her to move into another part of the country and establish a new identity without there being any public record of the fact that she had been divorced, and that the shame that would have gone along with that, because most men wouldn't have wanted to have anything to do with her, and Joseph was apparently not willing to destroy her reputation. Now, he would have believed that she could marry, but wouldn't want her to destroy her life and her reputation.
How can that be secret if you have to go acquire that?
As far as it being a part of public record?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Just not widely known.
it's not widely known. Yeah, that's so. A genuinely righteous man would never consider doing such a thing, putting away an innocent wife. Totally in contrast with what the Pharisees were saying. Contrast number 4 have to do with vows or oaths, verses 33 to 37. Again, you have heard that the ancients were told, "You shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord." All right, this passage comes from Leviticus 19, verse 12. Now, what had happened is that the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes had weaved a very intricate system of making commitments, some of which were binding and some of which were not, but you really didn't know which was which. And so they would tell you that they were going to do something, but when you came back around and expected to do it, they go, "Well, no, I swore by the temple." Now, if I had sworn by the gold in the temple, well, I would have been obligated, but I didn't. And so they're playing games with the idea of vows. And so they did not consider it to be a false vow if they would do that. They just considered it to be a non-binding vow. Now, if that's not a brow wrinkler, I don't know what is. But nevertheless, that's what had happened. And so the way that they twisted Leviticus 19 was such as it enabled them to skirt promises by legal jargon, I guess. Now, there's another aspect to this too, and that is that they kind of played fast and loose with what was something that was an official promise as opposed to something that was just said. Like, let's say I owe James $50. And James says, Denny, when are you going to pay me the $50? And I say, well, I'll pay you next week. Okay? Now, in their mind, that was different than James saying, when are you going to pay me my $50? And I say, I swear by the temple that I'll pay you next week. All right, now an oath or a vow has been brought into the promise that's made that I'm going to pay him. And so the Pharisees, they would say, well, when James comes around next week and says, where's my $50? Say, well, if you remember, I just said I would pay you. I didn't promise that I would pay you. I just said I was going to pay you. So, first of all, is Jesus saying, never ever, can't make a vow, can't make a promise, can't swear to anything? No. Let's make sure that we're not running further with this than logic would demand. Because if that's what Jesus is saying, then we got a serious problem with numerous passages in the New Testament where Jesus used oath terminology and Paul used oath terminology. What's that?
You got a name?
The one in Revelation 10, 5 and 6 is actually an angel who's taken an oath, or making an oath. One of the angels from heaven. All right, then you can see with the second point that I've got up there that if Jesus forbade oaths, then he's contradicting that which was allowed in Mosaic law, Exodus 22 and Numbers 5. So this can't be the point that Jesus is making. He's not going to say, well, the old law allowed it, and now I'm not going to allow it. So the point, be men of your word. Say what you mean and do what you said. That's his point. He's trying to bring them to a new level of righteousness where it doesn't make any difference how you said you would do something. whether it was with an oath, or whether you said, yes, I will, or no, I won't. You just need to do whatever it is that you said you would do.
James talks about that too, right?
Yeah. All right, let's look at the text. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by the earth, for it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. You don't need to be bringing in all of these various elements in order to make it a binding oath. Instead, verse 36, nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your statement be yes, yes, or no, no, and anything beyond these is of evil. All right, learn to establish the kind of righteousness where what you say is what you're going to do. And someone says, are you going to do this? Yes, I am. Then you do it. Someone says, you're going to do this? You say, no, I'm not. Then don't. Said you wouldn't. Don't. It doesn't have anything to do with you're making an oath or swearing one way or the other. You shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't do that. You should just be able to say, yes, I'll do it. And then you will. Or no, I won't. And then you won't. So the fact that there are oaths made in the New Testament would still play into the point that Jesus is making, which is you have to be a man of your word. There are some, and this is kind of a question that's no longer one that's thrown around in the churches, but you might encounter it someday, when if ever you have to testify in a court of law, you put your hand on the Bible and say, what?
I swear.
I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but. Well, there was a time that Christians said, can't do that. Violates what Jesus said here. Well, no, it really doesn't. It was not an application, a fair application of what Jesus was saying. What Jesus is saying, though, that when you make that promise, when you get on that witness stand, better tell the whole truth. Whatever you say better be 100% accurate to the truth.
Yeah, now they'll let Christians say, I affirm, but still the same thing, right?
It's still an oath at the same time. Yeah.
Swearing to someone that you'll do something for them is different than an affirmative or a negative.
In the first century it was. But obviously today we haven't played, we play different kind of games to get around the truth.
We just play the lie.
Yeah. The fifth category, the fifth contrast, has to do with revenge. Verses 38 through 42. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. All right, this comes from Exodus 21:24. Also Leviticus 24:20. Exodus 21:24. Now, the Pharisees had turned a law designed to bring about compassion and understanding into a law that encouraged revenge. That actually was a divine carte blanche to exacting revenge. When that wasn't the intent of law at all. It was designed to prevent revenge. And it was used as a license for revenge. it was God's intent that people look at the law and they say, I'm going to be really careful in what I do, because if I lose control, I get real mad at Miles and I pop him in the mouth and knock a couple of teeth out. Well, Miles could then use the point of law, and if I knock 2 of his teeth out, guess what? I get knocked out. If I do something and he loses an eye, well, then I could lose an eye. Even to the point, if I take a life, then my life can be taken. So it was meant to be, I need to be sensitive, I need to be under control, I need to not do anything stupid, because if I do, I could reap some serious consequences for my failure to control myself. Well, what the Pharisees did is that they said, whatever it is that someone does to you, drag them before us and we'll make sure that they get whatever that is in return. And so even if Miles and I were out there playing football and I throw a football and Miles does what he does, I throw him the football and he's going
Very similar face.
Very similar. So the football pops him in the eye and he loses the eye. Well, so Miles is going to use this law in order to say I deserve to have an eye lost. Well,
Sorry.
well, that's not the intent of the law. It was not to bring about revenge. He's mad at me because while we were playing catch, he suffered an accident, and now he wants payback. Well, not only that, but it didn't end up being an eye for an eye. It had a way that it morphed into something more than that. I love the story. It happened not long after I moved into Bear Valley. I saw a kid that had a black eye. Wasn't real bad, but you can tell. So I said, what happened? He said, I got in a fight at school. He said, really? He said, yeah. And the little kid said, but, I gave him 2 black eyes, and he's got this huge bruise on his arm, and he's got a skinned up knee. So I got even. That's his language.
You said that, Brent?
So,
Well, the kid would have been dead. The skills I possess.
all right. Well, that's the way it turned out. I got even. And it was supposed to be an eye for an eye, but it ended up being an eye for 2 eyes and an arm and a leg and stuff like that. So it was a manipulation and a treatment of the law that went way out of bounds with what God wanted. Jesus instead wants to talk about any kind of oppression and what should be a righteous man's response to oppression. First, he's going to say, you need to turn the other cheek. Verse 39. But I say to you, do not resist him who is evil, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. We saw this illustrated by Jesus himself. When he was mistreated, he did not respond with personal revenge, even though he had the power to fry the guy on the spot, but he didn't. Peter is going to say in 1 Peter 2:21 and following, even though he was reviled, he didn't revile in return. Jesus did not lash out against those who were his persecutors. And then he says in verse 40, And if one wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. All right? Here is a guy that's wanting to wipe you out, but you should still deal with the situation without having an attitude of revenge. Then in verse 41, he gives yet another illustration, and that is going 2 miles. And whoever shall force you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Now, this has to do with oppression by the government, because according to Roman law, a Roman soldier could demand that you carry his equipment 1 mile. And so the Jews had the barriers, the parameters of their property marked where what 1 mile was exactly. And so when the soldier would say, I want you to carry my stuff, all right, which way you going? That way they would go until they got to the marker, and then down into the dust would go all of the soldier's equipment, not an inch more. So imagine what it would have been like for a soldier that he is having you carry his stuff, and you're just right on by the marker. And he's going, oh, no problem, I'll take it another mile for you. Well, that would have been quite amazing. Well, it also would have been quite impressive. And a righteous person is one who is not looking to get the upper hand, but is willing to have a yielding servant mentality.
What would kind of be the purpose if you went to the second mile mark
You can still be oppressed, probably, at least went 1 extra mile. And then in verse 42, give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Now we're talking about the positive side of things. You've got not someone who's wanting to take, but someone who's asking for what you have. And you should have an attitude where you're willing to share, you're willing to give. Now, here are some aspects of this that we do need to address. First of all, Jesus does not mean to let someone harm you physically. That you have to, if it's a life-threatening, physically endangering situation, you have to sit there and let them beat you to a pulp. Or you have to let them rape your wife or kill your children, which is how some have run to an extreme with this particular teaching. He's talking about a slap. He's not talking about a knife to the heart. There's a big difference. You're turning the other cheek. There is not going to be something that's going to be endangering physically. Besides, Mosaic law in Exodus 22 and verse 2 did say that you had the right to protect yourself. If someone is breaking in, you can kill the guy, and there is no blood guiltiness on your account.
Now, how does that coincide with Christians, the illustration you gave Wednesday night, Christians who one said, all right, is it Lord Caesar or Lord Christ? And if you said the wrong one, we're going to kill you. Now, where would that apply? Would you be able to fight back if they're threatening your family?
Yeah, I think so. I think that would be really honest. Another point related to that, it does not mean that you cannot bring in the civil authorities. And that's the aspect of this teaching that I think is missed. Jesus is not saying it's okay, you have to become a whipping post for somebody. That you have to be like a little puppy with the tail between your legs and just let them pound on you. You have the legal right to bring in the authorities if you're being mistreated. You don't have the right to take the law into your own hands. If someone is saying, I want your shirt and I want your coat too, and they don't have a legal right to demand those things, give it to them, but then go talk to the law and say, this is what's happened. And let the law handle it. This is what Romans 12:18 through chapter 13, verse 7 is saying. That's why the government has been put in place by God in order to bring about justice and fairness, to bring a level of civility to life. Yes, sir.
Back to if your family is being, you're living in a place, you know the law, and if we're supposed to be subject to the law, then if we fight back, then we're not really being subject to it.
Well, if it's the law that's doing the oppression, well, that kind of gets in, I think, with what James was asking as far as the first century Roman persecution.
And is there a difference in, I don't know, you suffering because you're a Christian, or you're just suffering? You know, somebody wants to beat you up because you're a Christian. Do you let them, or somebody wants to beat you up just because they want to be mean? Is there a difference between?
Well, I think we would have to say, yeah, that there's getting back to the Beatitudes. Jesus made that point. I mean, we would have kind of defeated the purpose if Christians were constantly whipping out the sword and cutting off the heads of. But the fact that they patiently and humbly accepted that. They had a perspective, though, that this was really a blessing because they were going to the reward. And these guys were just helping them get to heaven sooner.
I got in a discussion about the guy's words, what he uses, the way he uses profanity, and it was over a CB radio, and he said, well, I'm just going to whip you. So I told him where I was at, and I never forgot it because I hope it was right. I said, I promise I will let you have the first swing before I try to fight back. That's what I said. I just didn't know what else to do.
Muscle.
Okay, so everybody knows you got question sheet number 4 due on Tuesday, and Brother Anton, we'll see you Tuesday.
Okay, have a good weekend, everybody. You too.
You too.